what US imperialism does is that it manufactures the instability. It comes into your country, wages these wars, drops these bombs, commits these massacres. And then when you point it out, their response is, no, you did it to yourself, right? Like, first they kill you, and then they say you did it to yourself. That's what's happening in Gaza right now, right? You raise all of these atrocities that are unfolding, and the first thing out of anyone's mouth in Washington or Tel Aviv is, oh, well, if Hamas weren't, if Hamas this, if Hamas that, right? Essentially putting the blame...
Hamas wasn't hiding inside premature babies, then we wouldn't have to kill premature babies. That's essentially what they say.
Exactly. Yeah. Like that's basically what they say, right? And they always just shift the blame back on the forces of resistance and say, oh, well, it's your fault because if you were just obedient, right?
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. What do North Korea and Palestine have in common? Well, for one, US government officials and media can say almost anything about them, no matter how racist, absurd, and lacking in evidence. And it'll be taken as fact as long as it makes them look bad. Anything goes to justify the continued isolation and threats of war against the DPRK while covering up the horrors inflicted on it by colonizers and imperialists. And anything goes to excuse Israel's genocide against Palestinians and their neighbors. But Western smears aren't the only thing they have in common. There's a history of solidarity, both rhetorically and materially, between North Korea and the Palestinian liberation movement. The question is why? What did it look like? Why does it matter? Conversely, what has Israel's role been in East Asia? And while we're on the topic of North Korea, what can we expect from a potential second Trump presidency that would no doubt accelerate the war on China and by extension North Korea? Has Biden been any different? What's the significance of the new strategic partnership between Russia and North Korea in this new Cold War era? Here to break all this down is Ju-Hyun Park, a member of Nodutdol for Korean Community Development, an anti-imperialist organization of Koreans in the US struggling for national liberation. Nodutdol just launched their new national US Out of Korea campaign. And Ju-Hyun is also engagement editor at The Real News. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Ju-Hyun, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here, Rania. Thanks for having me back.
It's fantastic to have you back on, and I want to point people after they're done watching this episode, which I know, even though I'm just now getting started on it, is going to be fantastic. You and I did an episode last year that was kind of a North Korea 101. So I want to just remind people of that, and I'm going to link to it in the description so that after you finish this fantastic episode, you can go watch that one because it was really good. But there's so much I want to talk to you about. And before we get to the central issue we're going to be discussing, which is the historic solidarity between the DPRK and Palestine, I want to start with some more newsy items since I've got you here. There was recently, with regard to North Korea, the announcement that Russia and North Korea had signed a mutual defense pact. And this was, it got a lot of attention in a very negative way in the Western press, of course. Mm-hmm. But it's also interesting because, just a decade ago, Russia was sanctioning North Korea. So that's a pretty big shift. So my question for you with regard to that is, and maybe you can just briefly explain what this comprehensive strategic partnership even means, but what's behind this shift and what's the significance of it moving forward?
Right. So it's kind of hard to overstate how important this new development between Russia and North Korea is. About a month ago, Putin conducted his first visit there in about 20 years, and the outcome was the Strategic Comprehensive Partnership. And that's the highest level of foreign relations that Russia has, and it's a position that I believe has only been previously shared between China and Russia. So this Strategic Comprehensive Partnership covers a lot of ground in terms of trade, in terms of diplomacy. Probably the most important thing is a mutual commitment to military defense. And while the strategic partnership is set up in a way where either party could technically end the relationship at any time, it is intended in the language of the partnership to be a permanent framework for Russia-North Korea relations going forward. So to me, this is a sign of North Korea's growing role on the international stage. And a lot of people might be taken aback hearing that statement because we're used to being told that North Korea is some kind of hermit kingdom that's totally sealed off from the world and doesn't have any kind of meaningful relationships beyond its borders. But the thing is, as I'm hoping we'll cover in this episode, that's never been true. North Korea has always sought to play a role in the wider world, particularly during the 20th century and what at the time was called the Third World Project. And our current perception of North Korea comes from the fact that it was one of the very few socialist states that refused to even partially liberalize after the destruction of the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, it faced some of the harshest, most barbaric consequences from the imperialist world out of any country on earth. So for a very long time, it is true that North Korea has been on its own, both economically and especially diplomatically. And once the era of US unipolarity dawned, Russia and to an extent China too really stopped extending their historic solidarity with North Korea because they couldn't afford to stick their necks out for North Korea's sake. So they went along with sanctions, they went along with the US obsession with trying to get North Korea to denuclearize, which was and still is essentially an attempt to get North Korea to surrender to the US. But now that era is starting to change, and it has everything to do with the crisis of imperialism that we're living through. The most important change is the blowback from the war in Ukraine, because the US really overextended itself in its attempts to sanction Russia, and as a result, it's really destroyed a lot of the incentive holding the sanction systems together internationally. It's one thing to tell countries that they can't trade with Cuba or they can't trade with North Korea, but trying to get countries to cut off trade with Russia is a whole other, ballgame. And what that did is really cause Russia to fully pivot east, which is something that had already been happening for several years. But Russia was put in a position where they needed markets for their products, particularly their energy goods, and they also needed strong partnerships in Asia in order to face a hostile Europe and the US. And guess who else is also looking for strong allies and trade partners? It's North Korea. So what we're seeing here is that, the imperialism of the US dominated order is starting to fall apart. And that's entirely as a result of its own contradictions, its own failures to manage or resolve the crises that it was creating. And so what the US did was put Russia in a position where its interests came into very strong alignment with North Korea's. And as a result, we're seeing relationships between the two countries flourish in the last couple of years. Things that seemed pretty unimaginable just 5 years ago are now taking place before our eyes. North Korean trade is up, and it'll probably only keep rising. Russia is defying US attempts to expand sanctions against North Korea in the Security Council. And we really are in a different era, and it's an era of many new opportunities for North Korea, but also a time of new dangers, because North Korea's partnership with Russia does mean expanded economic growth and a better security arrangement, but it also means that there's a renewed focus on Korea as a battlefront in the new Cold War. Because one thing that this new partnership does is really link the situation in Ukraine and Korea more closely than ever before. And what scares the West so much about the Russia-North Korea partnership is the possibility of Russia providing North Korea with new military technology and North Korea's potential to also augment Russia's military capabilities. So one of the first things the US and South Korea did after this partnership was announced was warn Russia and North Korea not to cross these lines in terms of technology transfers or even deploying North Korean troops to Ukraine, with the latter of which I think is something that's not really going to happen with any kind of serious possibility. But South Korea went as far as to even say that they would directly provide weapons to Ukraine if they felt Moscow was helping Pyongyang advance its military technology. So we saw a lot of focus on this matter at the NATO summit that just happened in Washington. NATO has been very focused on Asia in the last few years, even with the Ukraine war raging. And they're very intent on building a new super alliance in the Pacific that resembles NATO. And Korea is a very key ingredient in that process. And we know that NATO is really, interested in going after China, but it is a lot harder to get countries in the region to fully turn against China than it is to play on their existing animosity towards the DPRK. So last year, we saw the Biden administration leverage that to create a new trilateral military alliance with South Korea and Japan. And going forward, I think that we'll see that the North Korea-Russia angle is played into more as well, as the US tries to build up this Asian NATO in preparation for war with China.
Yeah, and before we move to the Palestine topic, I also just wanted to ask you, as we approach a presidential election in November, and by the time this airs, perhaps Biden will have stepped down and there'll be a different Democratic nominee. Perhaps not. I don't know. But regardless, so let's talk about the Democrats as just the Democrats in general. And then we have Republicans, which obviously Trump is their nominee, with having picked J.D. Vance as his vice presidential nominee. They're very extremely anti-China, especially J.D. Vance, who was kind of funded, his career was funded by Peter Thiel, who's like an anti-China billionaire in the U.S., a tech guy. All that's to say, have the Democrats been any different on China and, by, I guess, extension, North Korea? Because like you said, they do see North Korea as a major component of the war on China. And on top of that, what might, do you think, a Trump, J.D. Vance presidency administration look like? Would it just be kind of the same thing but accelerated, or would it be dramatically different than what we've seen under Biden?
Right. So we've definitely seen a really marked acceleration of US militarization and aggression against China throughout the entire East Asia, Western Pacific region in these last 4 years. And that's really building on trends that, were already developing during the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, that were further elaborated on by the Trump administration and carried forward by them. But I think what's happening now in the last few years is that this crisis of imperialism that we were talking about earlier is really starting to come to a head. And that's making the US very insecure in the Pacific in particular, because, that is the gateway to the most important economic region in the entire world, right? That's where the majority of the world's labor, the majority of the world's resources are concentrated. And so the US has, a really clear strategic need to be able to retain military and political dominance in this region if it wants to keep the American empire going, essentially. So there is a lot of focus from both parties in building up and maintaining their presence in Asia. And what we saw during this first term of the Biden administration has been a real emphasis on this Asian NATO buildup that I mentioned earlier, right? There's the JACUS alliance with Japan, South Korea, and the United States. There's a similar trilateral alliance between the US, Japan, and the Philippines. There has been an explosion of US war games throughout the region, particularly in Korea as well. In 2023, there were 200 days of US war games in Korea, which is most of the days of the year. The US military was conducting some form of military exercise in Korea with the intent of, rehearsing the invasion, the decapitation, even the use of nuclear weapons against the Korean people, right? So that's how we can kind of characterize the Biden administration. But I think when it comes to North Korea in particular, this is also a time that's been marked by, I think, a lot of strategic uncertainty and inflexibility in Washington, because the playbook that they had been using for the past couple of decades is really no longer working. And that's because North Korea has come to the conclusion that it can no longer really engage in the same types of diplomacy that it was engaging with the US in the past, because all those previous attempts did not really lead anywhere fruitful from the standpoint of North Korea, even though North Korea made very serious efforts to demonstrate their sincerity throughout all those processes. And the Biden administration is just sort of acting like it can continue to deploy, threatening weapons to Korea. It can continue to have, these very provocative war games, to build these alliances that really just, lead to the polarization of the region and really do a lot to increase tensions in the region. And that somehow, in continuing with this strategy, they will eventually just get North Korea to capitulate, to give in, right? But that's not going to happen. I think that there really has to be a reckoning in Washington that its approach towards North Korea has failed, right? They wanted to get North Korea to disarm, to surrender, to liberalize for many, many decades, and it's not working. But there's really a stubbornness and a refusal to recognize that within Washington. So I think that is a lot of how we can understand the Biden administration's particular approach to not only its Korea policy, but its Pacific policy, its China policy overall. I think getting to this question of what would a Trump administration look like, there are some important differences, I think, that are emerging. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, there is this crisis of imperialism that's happening at the global scale, right? The US is declining in its relative power. And there are people who are imperialists and want to perpetuate imperialism who are recognizing that and beginning to have, some serious discussions about how they should be handling the situation. And from what I've been able to surmise, it's clear that, the forces that are most loyal to Trump within the Republican Party are at the moment not necessarily the kind of like classical neocons that we are used to dealing with in the past. They're also not these like really hardline isolationists either. They're trying to kind of strike a middle chord, right? And so I think in general, how we can describe their approach to things is they want to de-emphasize the US's relationship to Europe and really place more of the onus of, the so-called security matters in Europe upon European states. And they also want to de-emphasize the Middle East to an extent so that they can fully pivot back to Asia and really focus their attention there. So there's some very interesting conversations that are happening around these questions right now. When it comes to Korea, there is a little bit of a different attitude among some of these Republicans, particularly towards the US-South Korea alliance. They don't want to end that alliance. I want to be very clear about that. And they don't want to withdraw from Korea either. But they do want a different kind of security arrangement with South Korea so that they can devote more resources towards China, because they're identifying that as the US's top priority. So some people in the Trump administration even want to end US operational control of South Korea's military. Some of them are even open to accepting the reality that North Korea is a nuclear state now and they can't really get them to denuclearize. But they're also, still clinging to this idea that they need to further militarize the region. They need to further militarize Korea, and Korea has a particular importance in their strategic, confrontation with China. And I think there's an interesting metaphor that this guy, Eldridge Colby, who is slated to be Trump's national security advisor, has been using in a few interviews with South Korean media. He says that China and the US are like heavyweight boxers, and North Korea is like a middleweight boxer. So the US, as a heavyweight boxer, can't exhaust itself fighting North Korea. So they need to beef up South Korea's capabilities to be able to handle that, because they need to conserve their strength for the heavyweight boxer, which is China. And that's obviously still a worldview that really sees Korea as another one of America's imperialist assets, and also really takes this notion of, confrontation and war with China as something that the US should be actively preparing for and seeking to win, rather than, looking for ways to build cooperation and to reduce tensions in the region.
I really appreciate you breaking all that down. And just on a side note, I wanted to say, because we can't not say, since the news of this just recently came out, is Max Boot's wife was indicted, I think, for failing to register as a foreign agent for South Korea, which I thought was interesting, like in exchange for favors or for Louis Vuitton purses. She did work for them, which I thought was, wow. It was a really expensive Louis Vuitton purse, though, to be fair to her, I suppose. But all that said, no, I do appreciate all those details, and it's going to be increasingly important to understand all that as this Cold War against China heats up. But now on to the issue that I wanted to have you on for in the first place, and that is the history of the relationship between the DPRK and Palestine. And, I've seen right-wingers completely losing their minds more than once due to clips of speeches you've given at various rallies on this very issue. And I think it's a really important history that most people are unaware of. And actually, I don't know the details of it, which is why I'm so happy that you're here to explain it to us. When we talk about that history of North Korea and Palestine, there's a material history of solidarity there. So can you, I guess, go ahead and start us off. Where does this begin? And what's going on here? What happened between North Korea and the Palestine solidarity movement in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to get into this topic. Before I do, I should have plugged our US Out of Korea campaign launch a little earlier, so I'm just going to do that really quickly right now. So I mentioned, that Korea is becoming a battlefront in the new Cold War. The US is really escalating its aggression in Korea. And there really is a need for there to be domestic political opposition from within the US because the United States basically has a free hand in Korea. And our organization, Nodutdol, feels that there's really an imperative need to bring an end to that free hand by mounting more of a movement to get the US out of Korea within the belly of the beast. And, we feel this is a really crucial time to be doing this because our consciousness of anti-imperialism is rising. And also, as we can see, the US has no real political solutions on offer through the two-party system. So there's really a need to be building the capacity of masses of people to intervene as a third force that can really, take back control of history and implement the kinds of solutions and, demand the kinds of realities that we need in order to get away from, this constant spiral of crisis that we've been locked in for the last few years, which the US is really doing nothing to abate and really is the primary factor in driving. So please check out, the launch event. It'll be live streamed through the People's Forum and also recorded on their YouTube. I'll be sure to share the link with you, Rania, after this. But yeah, let's talk about Korea and Palestine. Absolutely. So before breaking more into this, I do want to preface that my knowledge is way more limited than I wish it was, because I am limited in many ways. I am not an Arabic speaker. I really wish that I was, but I'm not. So, the amount of information that I'm able to share is, often actually going to be taken from the forces that would seek to demonize both North Korea and Palestine by pointing out their relationship with one another, since these are the folks who are producing the most information in English, at least, on this matter. So I do want to just kind of issue that disclaimer and also invite anyone out there who is a fluent Arabic speaker and influenced and interested in this topic to please, take up the cause of translation, conducting investigation, because I think that I would certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure that many other people would as well, to just have more resources available to understand this topic. So let's get into, the connection between North Korea and Palestine. I think the most important thing to understand is that North Korea is one of the few countries on earth that has never recognized the state of Israel. Never once. So at no point, during the 20th century, they've completely resisted any attempts at normalization for decades and decades. And that is a really hard position from which they are never really going to back down. They have consistently, supported the right of Palestinians to have a state. And they've also, never once recognized an inch of the territory of historic Palestine as being anything other than Palestine. And of course, recognizing the Golan as rightfully belonging to Syria. So I think that's just kind of the place that we should start from to understand how North Korea sees the question of Palestine. Now, getting into, some of the history of that material support, North Korea has had a relationship with the PLO going back to the 1960s. They've provided arms, training, funding to some extent as well. Arafat made numerous visits to North Korea throughout his political life and really, valued that relationship as a key strategic partnership for the Palestinian struggle. In 1970, George Habash from the PFLP also visited North Korea and secured arms and funding for his organization there. And, I did give a speech at the People's Conference for Palestine where I erroneously stated that he had personally received training in North Korea. I do want to clarify at this point that I was melding some facts together, but that the DPRK or North Korea did provide training and arms to a number of PFLP militants. So there is some connection there as well. I think another factor we need to take into consideration is North Korea's wider support for Arab nationalism and what we call the resistance axis to help contextualize their support for Palestine as extending beyond support for Palestinian resistance organizations. So North Korea had close relations with Nasser in Egypt especially, and they actually sent Air Force pilots into combat during the 1973 war when Egypt and Syria were trying to liberate the Sinai and the Golan. North Korea has continued to have close ties with Syria in particular and with Iran after the 1979 revolution. North Korea actually provided Iran with a lot of military assistance during the Iran-Iraq war back when Saddam was on the US payroll and basically fighting to keep Iran down on behalf of imperialism. So a lot of Iran's military advances since then are believed to have been achieved with some level of support from North Korea. And we know that Iran is very key to the supply network of the overall resistance axis. And it's also believed that North Korea plays a role in the supply network as well, particularly when it comes to supplying arms, technology, and technical advisors. Now, of course, this is all pretty rigorously denied by North Korea itself. I think that's something I do want to specify. But in 2009, there was a plane grounded in Thailand, which was found to have something like 30 tons of weapons of North Korean origin. And the plane was registered under Georgia, but it was believed to be ultimately bound for Iran. And that's according to US and UN investigators. So, we can take all that with a grain of salt, but there was a plane full of weapons that was found in Thailand, and it was going somewhere, and the weapons came from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So, we can safely say that North Korea has historically and probably still has some role when it comes to supporting the supply lines of the resistance axis, but they're not just involved in the rear, and that's where the North Korea-Hezbollah relationship also comes in. So, as listeners may know, there's an extensive network of tunnels in South Lebanon built by Hezbollah, and this has historically been really key to making the liberation war against Zionism in Lebanon possible. Now, the thing about tunnel networks like this are that they had their first really extensive use in warfare during the Korean War, when North Korea had to build a lot of underground facilities because something like 85% of the buildings in North Korea were destroyed by US bombing. So since the Korean War armistice, North Korea has actually kept up and expanded on its tunnel infrastructure as part of its defense apparatus. And it's known that a lot of their nuclear capabilities are actually stored underground because that keeps them out of reach of US precision strikes. So there's a lot of expertise and accumulated experience in this kind of construction that's in North Korea and been built up over generations. And historically, North Korea has helped other anti-imperialist forces develop their own tunneling capacities. That was particularly the case with the Viet Minh during the Vietnam War. And it's also believed that North Korean advisors and technicians helped develop Hezbollah's expertise in tunnel building, and that this technology was then carried over into Gaza, either directly or indirectly, to build networks of tunnels that the resistance is using to fight the war there today. So I think, this is a relationship that extends back decades and decades, something that, at least from the US and Israeli side, has been documented and commented on for a long time as well. And it's even coming up, in the present moment. It was just days after, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood that Israel began claiming that they were discovering weapons of North Korean origin being used by Palestinian resistance fighters. And I do want to specify, I am not a military specialist by any means. I am not the person you want in combat. I can't really tell like one type of weapon system from another, but they have consistently produced visual evidence that the Al-Qassam brigades are using something called the F-7 rocket launcher, which is a weapon of North Korean design and origin, as well as the Type 58 automatic rifle, which is a North Korean variant of the AK-47. And, given all of this historical background, it's certainly something that is plausible. And it's also something that's caught the attention of some of the most rabid Zionist forces out there. The Anti-Defamation League is actually currently involved in a lawsuit against North Korea and Syria and Iran. Yeah, they are. They're suing North Korea,
Syria and Iran. I can understand, but North Korea, okay.
Yeah, they're demanding
please finish. That's just news to me.
No, it's all good. It's all good. They're demanding $4 billion in damages for people whose relatives, were injured or killed on October 7th. And, they're doing this through U.S. courts. And the reason that they're able to do that is because the U.S. uses its state sponsors of terrorism list to then strip countries of their sovereign immunity, which then allows them to be prosecuted by the U.S. in its domestic courts. And the U.S. has done this to North Korea several times. They did it, in relation to the PFLP's operation on the Lod Airport in 1970. And what they do is that, they allow these lawsuits to proceed. They rule against North Korea or any other enemy state. And then they use that as a pretext to then seize North Korea's assets and then use those to pay off, the damages in these lawsuits, right? So it's all, very interconnected. And it's a really prime example of how the US, uses its laws and kind of assumes that they can be applied all over the world, but somehow, none of the other none of the other laws of any of the world's countries or international law for that matter can be applied against the US.
Certainly not those of the ICC.
Yeah, certainly not.
That's amazing though that the ADL named. I mean, I knew about Syria and in Iran, and it's not the first time that like Iran has been sued by some pro-Israel organization, not just about October 7th, but other things as well, to try to make them pay for things that they had nothing to do with. But regardless, that's just wild. The ADL, they always never ceases to amaze me. But that material history is so important. And so I want to move from everything you just mentioned to the why of it, right? Because I mean, why is North Korea doing all this? Why was North Korea assisting with tunnel technology from Vietnam to Gaza, if you will? What does North Korea get out of that? Was it selling it because it has a military industrial complex? I'm joking there, but can you explain the reason why there was that kind of material support?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually really good that you brought up, this idea that North Korea has some kind of military industrial complex akin to the United States, because that is how, these right-wing, pro-imperialist think tank people frame the issue, right? So I think it's actually important to kind of respond to that point first before getting into the truth. And, I think one thing to clarify is that, yes, these are weapons sales, right? There is money involved. There is trade involved to an extent. But the idea that North Korea is some kind of war profiteer, particularly as an accusation from the US, is pretty hilarious, first of all. But I think it's important to note that if North Korea were really driven by a profit incentive, there are way better ways to make money in this world than being engaged.
And by selling money to sanctioned groups and countries, they're selling weapons, to sanctioned groups and countries.
Yeah, no, it turns out that's actually not very lucrative at all, particularly at the scale of, the needs of a country, right? And so, I think we need to consider that, if North Korea was really driven by that, they would not be doing any of this. They would just be another lapdog of the United States and probably conducting trade with Israel the way that South Korea is, right? North Korea itself is also sitting on trillions of dollars in mineral reserves. So if they wanted to, the party leaders could at any time sell out and, sign off a bunch of mining concessions to transnational corporations and probably live very comfortably. At one point, Israel even offered North Korea $1 billion back in the 90s to stop giving missiles to Iran, and North Korea didn't take that deal. And it hasn't worked because this is about way more than money for North Korea, and that's because it is a revolutionary anti-imperialist state, right? It has its own history of colonization, of fighting against imperialist wars, and that gives it a strategic alignment with other anti-imperialist forces in the world. But there's also a very deep ideological motivation at the core of that. And to help illustrate that, I kind of want to share some quotes from Kim Il-sung commenting on the situation of Zionism and, the national liberation struggles of Arab peoples in general. So this first one is from an interview he did with the Iraqi Journalists Association when they sent a delegation to Pyongyang back in 1971. And they asked him about, Zionism, and he responded, and I quote, "The Arab people are vigorously fighting in arms against US imperialism and the Israeli aggressors. As long as the imperialists plunder and oppress the people by violence, the oppressed people can win freedom and independence and regain their deprived rights only when they fight with arms in their hand against their aggressors. This is a plain truth of the anti-imperialist liberation struggle proved by history." And then commenting on, Korea's support for Palestine, he said, "Our people's solidarity with and support and encouragement to the Arab people's revolutionary struggle are constant. The Korean people will continue to resolutely support the valiant struggle of the Palestinian people for liberating their homeland and the struggle of the entire Arab people against Zionism and imperialist aggression. And we will always remain a close comrade in arms of the Arab people in the struggle against the common enemy." So this is a position that has been held and espoused by the highest levels of North Korea's leadership for generations, essentially. It is a very deep part of how North Korea sees the world. And it's related to North Korea's own sort of revolutionary ideology and its own understanding of socialism. Kim Il-sung really understood the latter part of the 20th century. His analysis of the global conjuncture was as a so-called age of independence, a time when the forces of decolonization were directly colliding with the forces of imperialism and creating a very deep global crisis. And what he and the Workers' Party of Korea identified was that it was imperative for the cause of socialism that these independent forces in the colonial countries be rigorously supported. Now, some people might object, but not all of these forces are necessarily socialist, and that's certainly true. But I think to understand, why that support has continued in spite of that is, kind of understanding the way that North Korea's own approach to socialism and revolution has been conditioned by its own historical experience, because the lesson that they learned over generations of struggle against Japanese imperialism and US imperialism was that each country's people has to build their own revolution, right? It has to come from within that particular society, right? Revolution is something that develops according to the national characteristics of, countries that are oppressed by imperialism. And so that's why North Korea doesn't necessarily play a super sectarian role in terms of which anti-imperialist forces it's going to support, because they recognize that they both don't really have like a right to have a say, but also that that's not the way that revolutionary processes unfold, right? It happens within the particular characteristics and contexts of, particular societies, right? So all of this is really motivated, by North Korea's history, by its interests, but also its understanding of the historical moment that we are in, the role of revolutionary forces in colonial countries in particular, and really a sober assessment of how they can support those efforts, given their own capabilities. So, I think that's something that I really want to highlight, that, this is not about an arrangement of convenience. It's not about, sort of like a temporary alignment of interests. It's about a long-term vision of liberation and revolution at the world scale, and the role that North Korea is seeking to play within that.
Right, which is why you can have North Korea expressing solidarity with resistance across the region, regardless of whatever identity it takes on, I guess is what I would say. Like, it's not like, every major group or even country is some like, Marxist, Leninist, anything really. Yeah. You have a lot of Islamist groups, but yeah, it's like, North Korea. Now, I mean, this is how most anti-imperialist leaders do understand that as well. I wanted to ask, on the other side of this, I mean, you did mention, obviously, some of the pro-Israel antagonism towards North Korea in the case of the ADL's lawsuit. And then you did mention that, Israel tried to get North Korea to pay North Korea off to stop arming its adversaries. But I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the connection between Zionism and imperialism in East Asia. Because, around the world, you do have this use of Israel by the US as this tool to kind of do its dirty work. And you can see a history of that across Latin America, across Africa, and of course, the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East predominantly. Is there any of that in East Asia? What is Israel's history in East Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the more prescient points to start with is that, the RIMPAC exercises are currently happening in occupied Hawaii, right? And this is, one of the largest military exercises on Earth. I think it's something like 24 countries that are involved in these naval exercises right now. And Israel is actually participating there, I believe, for the first time. Now, Israel, I don't know how well everyone knows geography, but Israel is not in the Pacific. So really begs the question of, just what on earth are they doing there? Also, don't you have bigger problems to be dealing with at this moment than to, be deploying forces to Hawaii to participate in these activities? But I think, that really speaks to the role that Israel plays within imperialism at the world scale, right? But like, the things that they do in Palestine to Palestinians in terms of testing out weaponry, testing out counterinsurgency tactics, these are things that get exported all over the world, right? And I know that you've had, prior guests who covered that in depth, so I probably don't need to comment too much on it. But I think what we're seeing right now is that, their involvement in RIMPAC is very arguably, that process also being repeated, in the Pacific itself, and being exported to a lot of these Asian countries that are participating in RIMPAC at this moment, which includes South Korea as well. Now, in terms of Israel's like other role that it plays in East Asia, I think that there's a lot more to be gained from like analyzing how Israel as an outpost of imperialism in West Asia is mirrored in the U.S.'s vassal states in East Asia, and how there is a relationship between the two. Right. I think a very clear example is that South Korea has been saying for a number of years that it's going to develop a missile defense system based on Israel's Iron Dome. I don't really know whether that is continuing to be something that South Korean leaders see as something that's desirable, given the many failures of the Iron Dome that we've seen over the last several months. But I think that's an example of how there are direct military links between these outposts of imperialism in terms of transfers of expertise, technology, weaponry. Right. I think we could almost even say, in the same way that imperialists often accuse North Korea of being involved in proliferation, that Israel and the United States are also involved in the proliferation of this kind of destructive weaponry all over the world, right? But there's also like a deeper sort of historical alignment that I think is worth getting into, and that has to do with the coinciding of the Nakba and the division of Korea as happening in the same number of years after the end of World War II, right? And I think what we have to understand is that, what this did was really allow the US to have very firm outposts of control on either end of the Asian continent, right? Which has then allowed it to impose a very great degree of control and ownership over the productive forces of the continent that has, the most people out of anywhere on Earth, right? And it feeds a lot into sort of how these different regions have developed as well. And this is a strategy that started to come together in the lead up to the Korean War. Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, had this notion of the Great Crescent, that the U.S. would have to have military power and control of trade, particularly between the Persian Gulf and East Asia. And the reason for that was that they needed the Arab region to sort of be a gas station for the U.S. empire, right? They could extract all the necessary energy resources from that region, which meant that they couldn't have strong sovereign projects there because they would seek to nationalize those resources. And then those energy resources would then be exported to Asia, which was being rapidly developed as sort of the new industrial center of the world. And that involved, the proletarianization of literally billions of people over decades, right? And that really has done a lot to sort of set the stage for the kind of world political economy that we have today, right? Where a lot of the world industry is concentrated in this huge belt in East Asia in particular. And none of those factories that produce so many of the things that are feed the profits of U.S. corporations and finance capital, none of that could run without oil, right? And where is the majority of that oil coming from? It's coming from the Middle East, and so that's the really crucial role that Zionism also plays in like an overall strategy of U.S. imperialism, and it's very connected to what's happening in Korea as well, because after World War II, that was a time of upheaval where you had these old colonial empires starting to go into decline. You had an ascendant United States, and while I'm not saying that at any point someone sat down in a room and was like, here and here, these are the two important places, we're going to go for them, because a lot of this was sort of improvised and developed on the fly. But that is also how imperialism actually develops in many cases, right? Because as much as plans are made and laid, there are also great world historical events that happen very quickly. And, the way that imperialism responds often, sets the stage for, how future events will also play out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all really important. And there was something that you had mentioned to me specifically with regard to, which I thought was interesting, about the idea that the Zionist movement had approached the Japanese Empire. Could you just tell that story real quick before we move on? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, this is an interesting bit of historical trivia. I've been looking into it deeper, and it's actually that this was an idea that actually came from within Japan. And it's
Oh,
very interesting how this happened. So,
wow.
yeah, Japan in the early 20th century was a very aggressive, expansionist, imperialist power. It still is. It's just, they've kind of become like a junior partner to the US. So, like they have less of a need to be like as aggressive as they were in the past because the US does that for them. But what happened was that, in the 1930s, they invaded Manchuria, which is the northeast of China, and they established this puppet state there called Manchukuo, which, they ruled, as essentially a colony, right? And, Korea's colonization prior to that was really key because that was their land bridge to, like getting into China in the first place and like keeping the supply lines going. But something else that was also happening around this historical conjuncture was that the Russian Revolution was unfolding like 15 years before, right? And so a number of Jewish people who were living in the Russian Far East, ended up, leaving Russia, which then became the Soviet Union. And a lot of them, like either went to Manchuria or parts of Japan or to Shanghai in order to like find new lives, essentially. And, the thing is that the Japanese were also interacting with the Russian white forces, these, like pro-Tsarist, anti-communist forces who were also deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, right? And some of them were exposed to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is like this forged anti-Semitic document alleging like a Jewish conspiracy to rule the world, right? Now, Japan does not have a long history of interaction with Jewish people or like its own history of anti-Semitism necessarily. So from what I've surmised, there were a number of Japanese officials that read this document and were like, oh, wow, these Jewish people sound really important. We should form an alliance with them.
Oh God,
So,
no. Okay.
So
All right. I mean, that's one way to look at it, I guess, if you're going to look at a conspiracy theory,
Yeah, basically. So, some people in the Japanese Empire in like the 1930s like hatched some schemes to try to appeal to Jewish people in order to attract investment capital to Manchuria.
To attract the elders of Zion?
Yeah,
Sorry, it's just
basically,
such a wild
So,
story.
they were kicking around these
Okay.
ideas like, oh, maybe we could like settle them in Shanghai. We could like, give them like a little, settlement in
Piece of one of
Manchuria
our
or something.
colonies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. But I think, like while this wasn't something that originated from the Zionist movement itself, what it goes to
Okay.
show is that like, this thing that we talk about of Zionism always being a colonial project is very true, and that applies at a global scale, right? We know about the original plans to like establish a Zionist state in Uganda or in other places.
Right.
We know that Theodor Herzl was very clear from the beginning that, what they intend to do is colonization. So it's very telling that, officials in the Japanese Empire saw a unity of interest with the Zionist movement, even if their assessment of things was, based on anti-Semitism and like a bad understanding of, who Jewish people actually were. And, like, I think this just sort of goes to show, as I'm saying, that, these colonial powers have, historically been very amenable to Zionism because, in whatever form that it's taken, they've been able to see ways that their own interests could be advanced through those sorts of alliances. And that's, of course, the actual history of the Zionism that we've ended up with. It's just there was this sort of side episode where the Japanese were considering maybe we should be trying to like attract the Zionist movement over here. And of course, that didn't really end up leading anywhere. But, it was based on, this sort of like common assumption of interests at the end of the day.
Yeah, as my Zoomer nephew and niece would say, game recognizes game. So I guess like colonizers recognize
Exactly.
colonizers.
Yeah, colonizers recognize colonizers. That's perfect.
What an interesting history. I had no idea about that. So I want to expand a bit. I mean, all this is so important, but it wasn't just you referenced a few other places when you were talking about the history of solidarity with Palestine from North Korea's end. But it wasn't just Palestine, right? Like when you mention South Korea, or I'm sorry, when you mentioned North Korea as a central part of, or a central player in the sort of third world solidarity, anti-colonial struggle, what are you talking about there? Because obviously it expands beyond just Palestine or Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thing to understand, as I mentioned before, is that all of this is really centered around North Korea's understanding of the conjunctures of world history it's had to navigate, and its understanding of revolution and the role that it can play in it at a world scale, right? And so, North Korea really made concerted efforts to engage the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, particularly after the Sino-Soviet split, because they weren't really interested in taking either side of that dispute. And so what that meant is that particularly in the 70s and 80s, they developed a lot of engagement with anti-imperialist forces around the world, including other forms of material support. I think, one place I would really highlight that is in Africa.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.